Apollo 13 is an amazing example of just how razor thin the line is between life and death in space. Now, with Apollo 13, the crew did make it back alive, but only just. And the crazy thing is that had the disaster happened a little sooner or a little later, they would have died. And there would have been nothing that anyone could have done about it. It was all down to a single problem with the spacecraft. But how could one problem turn what was a simple, happy cruise to the moon to the prospect of everyone being dead within about 10 hours? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at today. And we're going to start by saying just how lucky they were that the spacecraft went wrong when it did. Okay, so that's the Earth-Moon system. We obviously want to take our people from the Earth to the moon, which is a little tricky, it turns out. So the Earth is, of course, spinning much faster here than it would normally spin, usually about once per day is normal. But we're going to launch from America somewhere, and we're going to put our spacecraft into low Earth orbit, where it's basically the top stage of the Saturn V that you put into orbit there, and you make sure everything's okay. And if everything's okay, then you're going to do another burn that's actually going to fire you off towards the moon. Apart from you don't aim towards the moon, you aim to where the moon is going to be in about 3 days' time, because it's going to take you 3 days to get out there. And very shortly after leaving the on this burn, you're going to dock the command service module and the lunar module, and then they're going to sit together quite happily for 3 days for the transit to the moon. And once you get to the moon, you're going to do another burn that puts you into orbit around the moon. So once we're in orbit around the moon, we're going to undock our command service module. That's wrong. It's a lunar eclipse. Okay, that was unplanned, and we're emerging from lunar eclipse. That is completely unexpected. That means there's a lunar eclipse in a few days, by the way. Anyway, so what you're going to do is you're going to undock your lunar module from your command service module. The lunar module is going to descend to the surface, where your guys are going to land on the surface and do their stuff for about a day or so, maybe 2. And then the top part of the lunar module is going to blast off, and it's going to rendezvous with the command service module in orbit. The guys from the lunar module are going to get into the command service module. You're going to jettison the lunar module, and then you're going to get another burn from the command module that will take you all the way back to Earth. Now, turns out the Apollo 13 disaster happened on the way out to the moon, happened about here somewhere, when the command service module and the lunar module were still happily docked together. If the disaster had happened once our guys had gone down to the moon, then the command service module dies in a few hours, and the remaining people are left stranded on the moon. If the disaster had happened a day or 2 later, about now, when they've all got back in the command service module and they're heading back to Earth, then without the supplies from the lunar module, everyone on the command service module would have died in about 10 hours. The amazing thing is, you can actually listen to the audio from this disaster and see the progression from, initially, yeah, we got a bit of a problem, but we should be able to work our way around it.
Let's remove the load from the fuel cell and see if it'll recover.
To the utterly desperate situation about an hour later when this line is uttered.
Yes, you can. When do you want this guys figuring out minimum power you can try 5550. Go ahead, ECS.
This is leak rates increasing all the time. Looks like we've got about 18 minutes left.
Thing is, the Apollo missions were fairly cleverly designed. So how can it be that merely one failure point like this almost killed everyone? Now, not a lot of people know this, but virtually all of the Apollo missions almost ended in disaster. Apollo 1, of course, did end in disaster, killing all 3 astronauts on the pad due to them using over 1 atmosphere of pressure of pure oxygen, in which essentially everything burns. And turns out this is actually very similar to the reason why Apollo 13 almost never made it back. Apollo 10 came very close to leaving the first bodies on the moon when they were meant to descend towards the moon, then do a mock separation launch. But when it did that, there was a glitch that immediately caused the ascent stage to roll, and a few more seconds like that, and it would have been irrecoverable. Apollo 11, the crew managed to break off the ascent engine arm switch, getting back into the lunar module, without which it would have been impossible to light the ascent stage. In the end, they managed to fix it by sticking a pen into the switch and flipping it that way. Apollo 12 was struck by lightning shortly after launching, causing all of their computers to restart, after which NASA prudently decided not to launch when there were thunderstorms nearby. Apollo 13, well, we'll see. Apollo 14 had all sorts of trouble docking the command service module to the lunar module. Again, something is kind of mission critical. Apollo 15 had some issues with the twitchy control on the command service module while it was around the moon, and Apollo 16 and 17 were mostly smooth affairs. Now, most of the Apollo mission design was about reliability. If it wasn't possible to have a backup system on something that was mission critical, then you needed it to be as reliable as possible. And other than that, it needed to be as light as possible. Now, some of the Apollo era technology has dated terribly. For instance, the Apollo guidance computer, which was a really critical part of the mission, and at the time, nothing like it had really been done before, could now be massively outperformed by really any smartphone. Other elements the Apollo program faced are as relevant and hard today as they were back then. Most notably the concept of keeping 3 people alive for some 10 days in something about the size of a few phone booths. The critical number being that the interior volume of the command module, so the little triangular bit on the top of the service module, is about 6 cubic meters. Okay, so that there is a cubic meter. Cubic meter of air, but 1 atmosphere, like it is at the moment, weighs about 1 kilo. If you would fill it up with water, it weighs about a ton, 1,000 kilos. Your average person, like me, weighs about 100 kilos, which means that if you were to squeeze really tight, you can fit about 10 people inside a cubic meter like this. It's a little tight though. Meanwhile, in the command module, that's the little bit on the top here, there were 6 cubic meters in the crew compartment for 3 crew members. So it's 2 cubic meters per crew member. So this is 1 cubic meter, which I assure you, if you have to get inside it, is pretty cramped. 2 cubic meters, you have some space, but not crazy amounts of space. And for those who don't like measuring it in cubic meters, we can always measure it in Bill and Ted's. Yep, that's about your command module in terms of volume and number of people in it. Now, there's a hierarchy of needs for humans to stay alive. The most important is you need oxygen. Without the oxygen, you die in less than a minute. So, if you put people in a box like this, how long until the depleted oxygen levels become fatal? Well, you happily live with 0.2 atmospheres of pressure of oxygen, which is what you're breathing right now, with the remaining 0.8 of an atmosphere being nitrogen, which doesn't really do much, so you just scrub that out completely when you go into space. Now, once you get down to about 0.05 atmospheres, that's the point where you basically black out and die of oxygen starvation. However, for every oxygen molecule you breathe in, you breathe out a molecule of carbon dioxide. The practical upshot being that by the time your oxygen levels get down to 0.05 atmospheres, your carbon dioxide levels are up at 0.15 atmospheres, where the level at which CO2 becomes fatal being somewhere between 5 and 10% for extended exposure. Okay, so the carbon dioxide buildup kills you long before the depletion of oxygen kills you. So how long does it take to breathe out a toxic level of carbon dioxide in a capsule like this? A person breathes out about 1 kilo of carbon dioxide per day. So if you've got 3 people, they breathe out about 3 kilos of carbon dioxide per day. Back of an envelope calculation, 3 kilos of carbon dioxide, with its density being about 3 kilos per litre, is about a litre of solid carbon dioxide. And if you want to turn a solid into a gas, there is an increase in volume of about a factor of 1,000. So our 3 astronauts are producing about a cubic metre of carbon dioxide at 1 atmosphere of pressure per day. And there are 6 cubic metres in the command module, which gives you a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 1/6 of an atmosphere. 0.16 atmospheres of carbon dioxide. And where was carbon dioxide fatal again? At about the 1/10 of an atmosphere mark. So left alone in the command module, everyone would die of carbon dioxide poisoning in about 10 hours. The solution is obvious, of course, and NASA came up with it pretty quickly. You need some consumables on board, most notably carbon dioxide scrubbers and oxygen tanks. But you need some power to run it all as well. But the problem is, of course, that means if you lose power to run things, things go south very quickly. And this is why if the command module had been coming back from the moon and it had lost power and the lunar module supplies were not available, everyone would have been dead in about 10 hours. But it's not just the oxygen that's a bit of a nightmare here. Everything in space is a nightmare. If it gets too hot, you die of heat stroke. Too cold, frostbite. And if you think that's maybe not such a big deal, maybe rather than thinking, Coke can in space, think of a dog in a car left alone for about 10 days. And that heat and cold problem applies to all the components of your spacecraft. Most particularly, if you've got cryogenic stuff on board, you don't want it to get too hot, otherwise it'll boil and explode. And if you've got some fuel for your hypergolic thrusters, you don't want it to get too cold, otherwise it will freeze and you won't be able to use your thrusters. And then lastly, to keep your people alive, you're going to need some other consumables like water and food. And you've got to do all of this with as little mass as possible. Now it turns out the mission planners weren't idiots, and they were thinking, hang on, humans breathe oxygen. If only there was some way we could also use oxygen to create power on the spacecraft, then we could save some weight in not having, different fuel supplies for everything. And there was one. It's called the fuel cell. It basically does the opposite of electrolyzing water. When you electrolyze water, you pass electricity through it, and you get hydrogen off at one electrode and oxygen at the other. The fuel cell basically reverses the process. You pump hydrogen in on one side, oxygen in on the other, and it generates electricity, some heat, and, of course, water, which your crew can then drink. So it killed a lot of birds with one stone. So what I've got here is a little demonstration of electrolyzing water there and a fuel cell in the background. So this guy, there's water in there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass electricity through that water using the power supply here. Who's going to give us 2 volts and about 1/3 of an amp, and immediately you should start to see the bubbles. That's the water being electrolyzed, and that's the hydrogen bubbling in there, and you should get some oxygen bubbling out at the back. Now I'm going to feed those 2 gases into the fuel cell here, and the fuel cell is going to do exactly the opposite of what the electrolysis cell did. So this time we're pumping in gases, we're pumping in hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, and we're going to generate electricity from this. And it's also wired up to a little electric motor, which if we're lucky, we'll actually get to spin. But for the moment, I'm actually just pumping the gas out into the environment here. So I've now got to stop that up. And in the background there, propped up on a command module no less, I've actually got my voltmeter. So we'll see how many volts that we're actually generating off our cell. And at the moment, it's not a lot. So it'll take a little while for the hydrogen, that's this boy down here, to work its way through the system. And as it does, the volts will build up. Which, for a little experience, I've just sped up here by about 10 times. And there you go. That's it spinning up. But just so you know, if you lose the pressure on one of these guys, you lose everything pretty damn quick. There is a slight problem in having all of your eggs in one basket, with having one oxygen supply, which keeps both your crew breathing and your spacecraft having power, and of course generating the water for your crew. So if that one system fails, everyone is in a desperate situation very quickly. So they're thinking, okay, great, let's just add some redundancy to the system. So rather than just having it all running off one oxygen tank, we'll have 2 oxygen tanks. And we can run off both of them, but we always want it such that if one of these fails, we can make it back to Earth on the spare oxygen tank. And that's great. Now we're not critically dependent on one oxygen tank. And of course, you need the same thing for the hydrogen tanks. And rather than just having one giant fuel cell, they say, right, we're going to go for 3 fuel cells, of which we can comfortably complete the mission on just 2 of them. Now, oxygen and hydrogen tanks aren't usually things that you have to worry about, and that usually you just plumb them in and they're basically good forever. Now, these were a little different in that the oxygen tank here took liquid oxygen, a bit solidy, but basically it took liquid oxygen and it was a Dewar flask. And the wall of those Dewar flasks was about 0.5 millimeter thick, which, for frame of reference, the typical thickness of the metal on a car body is about 0.7 millimeters. So it's fairly thin, but what sort of pressure did it take? Well, it was the best part of 1,000 psi, which is about 60 atmospheres. That's actually still quite a lot. I mean, it's not the 200 atmospheres of the big heavy cylinders, but it's still fairly significant. But the numbers that you're looking at here are basically fairly standard for a cryogenic Dewar in any large lab. So here's me filling, ironically, Dewar number 13 with liquid nitrogen. And this is a bit bigger and different shape and a little less sophisticated than that on Apollo 13. And that thing takes, I forget what it is, 100, 200 litres or something, which is sort of your own body weight in liquid nitrogen. With the physical properties of liquid nitrogen essentially being identical to those of liquid oxygen in terms of, melting point, freezing point, enthalpy of vaporization, that sort of thing. Now, whilst in this Dewar, of course, it's a great way of storing it, but how do you get it out? What if you want to breathe or something? Well, the way that you get these things out is you put a heater into the liquid nitrogen, or liquid oxygen in this case, and you heat it a bit. And as you heat it, that increases the pressure, and you can bleed off the extra pressure and use that oxygen to do whatever you want with. I mean, here's a sort of simple mock-up I made using liquid nitrogen and a heating element. Cool. So I have to be quick here, otherwise it'll start to condense everywhere. So if we connect our heating element up and turn our power on, we should get some boiling. We turn the power off, boiling should stop. On top of that, the Apollo oxygen tanks also had overpressure valves, such that if the pressure got too high for any reason, rather than just waiting for the tank to explode, it just vents the excess pressure. So it really was a very safe system, and it was very difficult to see that anything could go seriously wrong with it. Now, the oxygen tanks were fairly small, containing about 150 kilos each, and, for reference, people weigh 150 kilos. They're about half that, but it doesn't really matter. It's basically a human's body weight in liquid oxygen was what was in each one of these tanks. And how much of this was required to keep the crew alive? Well, you'll recall from earlier that humans require about 1 kilo of oxygen per day. So for 3 people, 3 kilos per day for a mission of 10 days, you're looking at about 30 kilos of oxygen. And they had a total of 300 odd on board the spacecraft. Now, the remaining oxygen, of course, was mostly going to be used to run the fuel cells and power the spacecraft. In fact, bizarrely, the numbers are not far off what humans here on Earth get through per day. And that you, just like the guys on the spacecraft, breathe in 1 kilo of oxygen per day and breathe out 1 kilo of carbon dioxide. But the energy requirements for a first world lifestyle require the creation of about 10 kilos of carbon dioxide per day. Or another way of looking at it, humans run at about 100 watts of power. Meanwhile, each of the 3 fuel cells ran at about 1000 watts of power. The critical bit is that most of the energy went into running the spacecraft. The radar, communications, computer, power for the reaction control system, and so forth. A lesser amount of that went into actually keeping the people alive. So at this point, we can do a rather cute little comparison that to get people to the moon, to keep the humans fueled while they were going to the moon, required about 30 kilos of oxygen. And to power the spacecraft required the consumption of about 300 kilos of oxygen, which pales into significance when you compare the amount of oxygen that was required to burn the fuel to launch this rocket in the first place, which was about 1,500 tons of oxygen, which is 1.5 million kilograms of oxygen. Good. So you now have your humans with an oxygen supply, and it's also running 3 fuel cells. And those 3 fuel cells are running 2 electrical power systems called buses. And buses are, they're basically like power strips. And there are a bunch of devices hardwired into those power strips which you can run off these buses. Yeah, they're DC buses, but yeah, it doesn't matter. And off these buses, you have all of the critical service module systems, like reaction control thrusters, which allow you to point the spacecraft in whatever direction you want.
Okay, I'm going to roll left.
Apollo Control, Houston, 177 hours, 37 minutes ground elapsed time. Ken Mattingly aboard Casper, doing a 360-degree roll per the flight plan.
Navigation, fans to push the air through the carbon dioxide scrubbers, and so forth. You cannot survive long without power in a spacecraft like this. So, in an emergency, they could throw batteries onto these buses to keep them running for a limited amount of time. And obviously this was a bit of a stopgap measure. And also, if you were keen, you could put those batteries back on the buses to charge them. They were rechargeable batteries. And you can basically run the system off just one of those buses. The system is remarkably robust. The oxygen tank had redundancy to it. The fuel cells had redundancy to it. And the internal electric system had redundancy to it. It was very difficult to see how a single failure could cripple the spacecraft. So what did go wrong? Well, the unthinkable happened. One of their oxygen tanks blew up, for reasons I'll come to shortly, but it's very similar to the reason that killed the crew of Apollo 1. Now, the loss of one of their oxygen tanks would have triggered an abort of the mission, but it shouldn't have been fatal. However, the 2 oxygen tanks were situated next to each other, and when one of them blew up, it damaged the plumbing to the second one, causing it to leak slightly. Now, even slight leaks into space are a real problem because you can lose gas really quickly. Cool. So a guy in the lab is building a cryostat. Yeah, basically something to keep things cold. Apart from, didn't work too well. Well, actually it worked fine, but it was leaking. And the thing is, this cryostat has to also work in a vacuum chamber. So what you're going to be watching here is what happens when liquid nitrogen leaks into a vacuum chamber. And what happens is, in a vacuum, it evaporates, same as water, and as it does, it cools down. And when it cools down, it freezes really very quickly. So what you're looking at here is liquid nitrogen freezing in a vacuum. In fact, you can go through some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and it turns out this leak here is probably about a factor of 10 smaller than the leak that killed the service module on Apollo 13. Now, from that point on, the spacecraft is royally screwed. Once the second oxygen tank bleeds out, you lose power to the command module. You are completely reliant on the batteries to stabilize the buses. But those are an emergency provision which are good for maybe 20 minutes. And once those are gone, you are dead on every level because you have no power to run the carbon dioxide scrubbers, which is what will kill you first. And even if that doesn't kill you, you've lost your oxygen tanks. And even if that doesn't kill you, you've lost all the power to the spacecraft. you can't talk to the ground, you can't navigate the spacecraft, and even if you knew which way you wanted to point, you've lost power to the reaction control system. However, the crew of Apollo 13 don't know any of this yet. All they know is they stirred their oxygen tanks, and about a minute or so later, a minute during which nothing of note really happened, there was a bang, and they've got a power undervolt on one of their buses. Let's see how long it takes them to work this out.
Okay. Stand by, they got a problem.
We see a hardware restart.
So that's the start of the disaster at 55 hours, 55 minutes into the mission.
He's flipping our fuel cells around, Flight.
Well, let's get some recommendations here, Si, if you got any better ideas.
Main bus A undervolt now too, Sean.
Right.
So we're about 3 minutes in, and he's lost power completely on one of his buses. And he's flipping around the fuel cells to try and get power back onto the second bus. But in doing so, he's putting too much strain on the bus A, which means it's giving an undervolt. He's not getting enough juice out of the single fuel cell that he's got left to run everything that is plugged currently in to that main bus.
Fuel cells 1 and 3 are offline. We've got main A volts, we have no main B volts. Have them attempt to reconnect the fuel cells. Larry, you don't believe that O2 tank 1 pressure, do you?
No,
Surge tank's good. Catch eye.
5 minutes into the disaster, and we get our first reference to the oxygen tank 1 showing a low pressure.
Request.
Okay, but wait a minute. We got a good main A bus. Let's make sure that whatever we do doesn't screw up main A.
Fuel
main
cell
A
2 is on main A flight.
Okay.
I'm not going to ask to change that.
6 minutes in, and the flight controller is getting worried that all of this just trying stuff might actually knock the power off the only remaining working electrical bus on the spacecraft, which means they can't talk to the ground or do anything.
We're not going to touch fuel cell 2 flight.
Okay, but if we got any problems in the system, I want to make sure that we don't blow the voltage off main A, and then we're not going to be able to see anything.
8 minutes in, and the flight controller adds a fairly grim assessment.
We're showing
Can we review our status here, Si, and see what we've got from a standpoint of status? What do you think we got in the spacecraft that's good?
main bus A is reading 25 volts.
And what's left on the spacecraft is good, is they have one working fuel cell.
Let's throw a battery on bus B and bus A.
Okay.
Until we sack it out.
Okay.
We're getting undervolt.
Flight econ.
And fuel cell 2 just isn't cutting it. It's not producing enough juice. So they're going to put a battery onto main bus A to stabilize it. And then they're also maybe going to put a battery onto bus B to bring it up to maybe use it as a diagnostic.
You got it?
Yeah, if you believe that N2 pressure, we blew a sphere.
Okay, Flight, we got Omni Charlie and high bit rate.
Yeah, we might have lost fuel cell 1.
Okay. You
And it looks like fuel cell 2, 3 is gone
Right.
too.
Okay.
So we're 10 minutes in, and we're getting our first speculation of how desperate their situation might be, in that they might have blown one of their spheres and lost 2 fuel cells.
Okay, give me a minimum fuel usage configuration that'll keep me out of it.
At this point, the ground crew is thinking that there might be a problem with the reaction control thrusters, because they can see that the spacecraft is rotating when it shouldn't be, and a malfunctioning thruster would do this. So they're trying to isolate thrusters in the hope that this fixes the problem. It'll also save fuel, because there is a limited amount of RCS thruster fuel on the spacecraft. And when it's gone, you're helplessly tumbling through space.
Let's remove the load from the fuel cell and see if it'll recover.
12 minutes in, and we're doing the metaphorical equivalent of jiggling the cord to see if that'll help it somehow.
You want to take make sure that fuel cell 3 and fuel
Take it
cell
off
1
the
are
bus.
disconnected, huh?
Take fuel cell 3 off the bus.
Okay. Fuel cell 1 and 3.
Yeah.
Econ flight.
Flight econ.
Then, as we hit about the 15-minute mark, a bombshell comes in.
Flight.
And Jack, our O2 quantity number 2 tank is reading 0. Did you get that?
O2 quantity
That's
number
right,
2
the
is
flight.
0.
That's the
That's
AC
AC,
problem.
okay.
Roger.
Yeah, that's because of AC. And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something.
Crew thinks they're venting. So
We
I
are
heard that
venting
flight.
something out into space.
Fighter
Roger,
econ.
we copy your venting.
Now, this is where it gets desperate on every level, because you know that leak is coming from somewhere on your spacecraft, and the mere fact that you can see it means that it has to be a fairly large leak. That leak is a consumable that you needed to run your spacecraft, and now it's bleeding off into space.
No, we'll be knocking that
now
KOH
everybody
into the
keep
O2
cool.
side.
We got LEM still attached.
Fuel
The
cell
LEM
3.
spacecraft's good. So
Now, we got
need,
venting overboard.
to
There's
get
the
back
TC
home, we
going
got
down
LEM
on
to
fuel
do a
cell
good
1 now.
portion of it with.
Okay, now we don't have any heaters.
Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that's going
We
to
might
blow
have
our
first
CSM
valves open
electrical
on
power
fuel
with the
cells.
batteries, or that will cause us to lose the main or the fuel cell number 2. Okay, we want to keep the O2 and that kind of stuff working. We'd like to have RCS, but we got the command module system, so we're in good shape if we need to get home. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing.
So that was 16 minutes in, and the realization is now dawning that this isn't a jiggle the cord type problem, and that they're really close to losing all power on the spacecraft, and that treading cautiously is a requirement here.
Dick, which one you want?
Bravo 3,
Emergency
Bravo
what?
4, main A.
Coast PTC, emergency power down.
Charlie 1 and Charlie 2.
A14-4.
17 minutes in, and first mention of emergency power down to reduce the strain on the electrical system.
What are we going to be doing with these, GNC?
Yeah, that'll give us one jet in each direction on each axis.
Okay.
Flight guidance.
Go, guidance.
He's getting close to gimbal lock.
Gimbal lock is where the 3 gimbals in the spacecraft all align on one axis, and it's a sort of irrecoverable position, which is very bad because after that you don't know which way your spacecraft is pointing.
Capcom. Okay, Capcom recommend he bring up C3, C4, B3, B4, C1, C2, and main A, and advise him he's getting close to gimbal lock.
13 Houston, we see you getting close to gimbal lock there. We'd like you
Guidance
to
flight.
bring
Go
up
ahead.
Could
all
we
quad Cs
go
on
to a
main
course
A,
line on the
quad
platform
C1,
here,
C2,
so we don't
C3,
have to use
C4
our
on main
gas
A,
if we need
and...
To which they turn back on some of the reaction control thrusters.
Okay, can you tell us anything about the venting, where it's coming from? When do you see it at?
Ecom this DPS.
Okay. It's coming out
That's
of window
on,
one right now, Jack.
Meanwhile, at about 20 minutes, they're desperately trying to reduce the power consumption of the command service module.
Okay. What? You want to go to power down? Give me the page.
Emergency 1-5 flight. We'll go down, try to get a delta of 10 amps reduction. Dick, what do you want to turn off now? We got to go down this list here. There ain't much we can hit right off that's not already off.
Go, GNC.
Can we afford to do a
Say again, Ecom. There's not much that we can take off that's not already off.
23 minutes in, and you hear the first speculation about we've got to get the batteries off the buses because you need those batteries for re-entry.
Necessary maneuvers
Get
now.
fuel cell 2 on and the batteries off.
Try
On both
to
buses
use
and
any
the
of
batteries
equipment
off.
on board the spacecraft.
Because we need those batteries for entry. Yeah, we got to go all the way down to 40 amps though, see? That's okay.
25 minutes in, and the speculation gets remarkably close to the target.
Yeah, he's down to 42 amps now.
Ecom ECS.
Go.
Hey, Si, we could have lost O2 tank too.
Yeah?
That looks like the one.
Now let's see if we got to get a pressure readout on that thing.
Right.
If we can.
Technical detail at this point. The DC buses can be used to generate AC power, AC buses, on the spacecraft. And to get the pressure readout, you need that AC bus working.
If he's never do it, he ought to be able to do it
Okay. Flight Econ?
This is a go, Ecom.
Okay, I need one thing right now. He's powering down. He's down to 41 amps total spacecraft. I'd like to get my AC2 bus back so I can look at O2 tank 2 pressure. I have no insight into that.
Okay.
Let's get, I guess we can put inverter 3 to main A, AC2.
So here we are about 26 minutes in, and the electrical, environmental, and consumables guy is wanting to actually work out what's wrong with the spacecraft. And the flight controller is a bit worried that they're going to make things worse by just messing around with the electrics on the spacecraft. And this is where the Ecom kind of lays it on the line.
Main A is up high enough where it can handle the inverter.
Well, the thing that concerns me is throwing equipment. We had a problem. We don't know the cause of the problem.
Flight, I've got a feeling we've lost 2 fuel cells. I hate to put it that way, but I don't know why we've lost them. It doesn't all tag up. And it's not an instrumentation problem, the best I can tell right now.
Okay, I'll tell you what, let's discuss this for just a little bit longer there, Si. Cap.
And they've both got pretty good points here, in that one needs to really work out what's wrong with the spacecraft, and the other one is looking at it from the point of view of status, which is they have a working fuel cell, a working main bus. Where is the incentive to rush and maybe make things worse?
And roll. So I'm suspecting that
Fuel
maybe
cell.
it's whatever it is that's bending back there. I've had to use
Fuel cell, hey Dick. Yeah.
direct
Fuel cell
power
2 pumps are on
stabilizers. As
AC2.
soon as I do, we're starting to pick up rates again. Can you pick up any jets firing?
I'm trying.
And this is really bad news again, in that once they get the spacecraft pointing where it's meant to be pointing, it starts rotating again, which means you're venting enough gas to actually spin the spacecraft. That's bad news.
Light, did you hear him say?
Dick, you want that battery on?
Yeah, we've been on that 30 minutes, but we take it off now. We're going to put that fuel cell 2 to its knees.
Raj, GNC,
We've got
watch
to power
those
down
thrusters,
some
will
more.
ya?
30 minutes in, and the problem is getting pretty grim, in that while they've got a working main bus, it's not really producing enough power, so they're stabilizing it with a battery. The problem is that's drawing power out of the battery, and they need that battery for re-entry. So they've got choices. They can either draw amps on the battery now, which might cripple them later, or you can take the battery off now, which will really stress the fuel cell. And that's dangerous, seeing as that fuel cell is the only sensible way of generating a significant amount of power for an extended period of time on this spaceship.
Okay, you got 2 good AC buses. What did all that tell you now?
It tells me that, well, just give me about 2 more minutes, Fly.
Okay, take your time.
So Ecom now has power to his AC buses, and he's getting some insight into what the status of the oxygen tanks are.
Okay, Jack, and the way our configuration we're sitting in now
It was about
is we have
860
the
and a
hatch
temperature of
installed.
about
We still have the probe and drug
192
inside the command module. We're going to stay in this situation until you kind of give us an okay to reinstall the probe and drug.
Raj, confirm
We're
Captain.
ready to use the lab consumables.
Yeah, that's 35 minutes in, and the crew of Apollo 13 is actually suggesting that they might need to get into the LEM to use the consumables, the oxygen, carbon dioxide scrubbers, that sort of thing. So they know at this point that this is a pretty desperate situation.
Ecom ECF.
Go.
Okay, Si, what were you going at here?
Trying to figure out what happened to that O2 tank 2.
Right. Now our pressure still should be good. And you see, we got our low point there.
Why did the temperature drop so suddenly?
Because it probably don't have anything left in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're losing tank 1, if we can believe it.
35 minutes in, and the complexion of the problem changes completely with that one statement.
Because it probably don't have anything left in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're losing tank 1, if we can believe it.
Losing what?
Tank 1 pressure.
Yeah. No heater cycle. I can believe it.
Well,
And it's the only one on the line now if tank 2's failed.
Now, it's actually wrong here. Tank 1 has actually failed, but it's not intuitively obvious at the moment, and this is why. So here I have my mock-up of the Apollo 13 oxygen tank, and I'm going to simulate the draw of the fuel cell by attaching a vacuum pump. There we go. I'm going to connect a vacuum to the top, and we'll see what happens. And you will see that we get a lot of boiling, and as we're getting lots of boiling, it'll be getting a lot colder. Now, see if I can get some of that frost off with a bit of a wipe with some acetone. Oh, that's nice. So you've only got to cool liquid nitrogen down about 15 degrees for it to start to solidify. And as I cool down my nitrogen here, you'll notice that it's not boiling quite as much anymore. And the reason it's not boiling as much is because it's getting colder and colder and colder. And still no signs of it. Oh, here we go, here we go. It's starting, it's starting. It's starting to solidify. It's actually starting to solidify with all the evaporative cooling. And that's what would have happened to the oxygen tanks in Apollo 13, whilst they were sucking oxygen out but not putting any heat into it. If I take off the vacuum and let warm air back in there, you'll see that also almost instantly turns it back into liquid. Now, if I turn the heat on here, what you'll see is even though I'm piling heat into it, you can hear I'm piling heat into it, but it's not boiling. And the reason it's not boiling is because it's got to heat up to the boiling point first, which is actually going to take a little while. So if I want to regenerate the vapor pressure on this, I've got to put heat into it. There we go. Now it's starting to boil. Boom. So that's the fundamental things that you've got, is when you suck gas out of these things, it gets cold, which means that the gas doesn't come off as quickly anymore. And if you want the gas to come off quickly, you've got to heat it like that. And it's color heat.
Yeah, and we're losing tank 1, if we can believe it.
Losing what?
Tank 1 pressure.
Yeah, no heater cycle. I can believe it.
Well,
and it's the only one on the line now if tank 2's failed.
So he's right that if you were just drawing oxygen out of one of these tanks, you expect the temperature and the pressure to go down. The bit that doesn't really quite feel right is the amount that it's gone down. In that it's a 150 kilo tank, and that's quite a lot of mass to change the temperature of. And secondly, you're only drawing oxygen from it to go to one fuel cell.
It's going down. It's been going down. Surge tank's going down.
We blew the manifold?
It looks pretty good that we blew it between the check valve and O2 tank 2. In other words, I don't think O2 tank 1's affected, other than it doesn't get any heater cycles right now to boost the pressure up. I'm hoping that's right.
Well, I hate to go manual heat, wouldn't you?
So the solution at that point is simple. You just need to apply some heat to the oxygen tank, turn on the heaters, and that'll increase the pressure of oxygen in the tank, which means that you can get more juice out of your fuel cell.
Okay, give me some real-time plotting on how we're using our CS.
Oh, we're going to lose fuel cells and everything.
In the pitch axis, we really don't seem to be using any, and that's why.
There's a worry here that they're using too much fuel on the reaction control system thrusters, because you run out of that, and your spacecraft is just tumbling helplessly through space.
Give me a gross amount of RCS propellant consumed so far.
Almost 40 minutes in, and the priorities are build up pressure in the oxygen tank and get the battery off the bus.
We've really got to get that battery off the line and power down some more. And we've got to get some main B power back so we can build our pressure back up in O2 tank 1. It's down to 318 psi. See, with main B down, we have no heaters in O2 tanks.
Okay, what do you want to power down?
And just so you know, the operating pressure of these tanks is meant to be 900 psi, which is about 60 bar, and they're already down to about 1/3 of that.
ECS Ecom, is that surge tank going down?
Roger that.
Okay. Flight Ecom?
Go Ecom.
Let's have them isolate the surge tank also and save it. We use the cryo as much as we can.
So the surge tank is a high pressure tank, so it'll provide all the pressure that you want, but it's also in the command module. It's one of those things that, again, you kind of need for re-entry.
Say that again?
Let's isolate the surge tank in the command module.
I don't understand that, son.
I want to use the cryo as much as possible.
But that would seem to be the opposite if you want to keep the fuel cell going.
So the reason the flight controller is questioning this is you need the extra pressure to keep the fuel cell running. And the oxygen tank at the moment isn't providing that. So you can get the extra pressure out of the surge tank.
The fuel cells are fed off the tanks in the service module flight. The surge tank is in the command module. We want to save the surge tank, which we need for entry.
Okay, I'm with you.
Roger.
Capcom, let's also isolate the surge tank.
Just over 40 minutes in, and Ecom realised they made a bit of a mistake in that they don't actually need to get the dead power bus working in order to get the heaters on in their low-pressure cryo tank.
Tank, over.
Hey, O2 tank 1 should come off of main A. It's power.
That's right.
Shut the tank off now, Jack.
And so it should be operating.
Roger. Hey,
You're right.
that's very interesting, Larry, that it's not operating.
However, when they were trying to power down earlier, they probably turned the heaters in the oxygen tank off at that point.
Flight Econ.
Would you consider put a battery on bus B long enough to get the pressure up?
Well, I want to determine whether or not the 5 amps is going to hurt us any. That's going to be in main A, incidentally. I made a mistake. O2 tank 1 heaters are in main A. Flight Econ?
Go, Ecom.
Okay, since O2 tank 1 heaters are on main A, and we've got them off now, we'll be able to stand the 5 amps temporarily for a manual pressurization. Let's have them turn the heaters on manually in O2 tank 1.
O2
And we'll watch the pressure.
tank 1.
There is still hope at this point that if they manage to get the heater on in this oxygen tank, the pressure will come up, they'll just start generating more power, and things won't be quite as desperate as they are at the moment.
Yeah, he's got that suit compressor
Roger,
off.
copy
Larry.
them, and we'd like to build up the pressure in O2 tank 1, so turn the heaters on manually. We'll watch the
You're going to
pressure.
keep track of that time, huh?
Roger that.
You can stand the 5 amps on main A.
Okay, you're going to
We
get
think
a
so, Flight.
interval, probably.
Roger, we realize that. We feel we can stand 5 more amps on it.
50 minutes in, and it's crunch time. They're about to turn on the heaters in the oxygen tank.
Okay, 26.9,
See a
huh?
5 amp
Yeah,
increase
26
there, Ecom?
Do you see a 5 amp increase there, Dick?
That's firm.
Okay, that's firm, Flight.
Okay.
26.7 volts, looks good. We'll watch
Okay.
the pressure. Flight ECS Econ.
Go.
It looks grim.
Yes, it does.
Got the 5 amps and no pressure increase.
That are going to be in a position to evaluate.
It's going down. We're losing it.
Okay.
Yes, we are. Let's try the fans, Si.
Okay.
Yeah, when you turn the heaters on, you expect more or less an instantaneous rise in the pressure, and they're not seeing any.
Flight Econ.
Go ahead, Ecom.
I want the fans on and O2 tank 1. We're not seeing a pressure increase. We can stand it.
You can stand it.
That's firm.
Fans on in tank 1, right?
Affirmative, Flight.
This is kind of desperation stuff at this point, in that if you put heat into the tank, the pressure should rise. Now, it's conceivable that the pressure doesn't rise as quickly because it's an oxygen tank in zero gravity, all the stuff's just floating around. Maybe if you stir it up a bit more, you'll get better heat contact between the contents of the tank and the heating element.
Okay, bring on the fans for those
GPS, go. We're in a serious problem if we can't get any pressure down. We got to power down some more here.
That's right. And luckily we got the LEM.
Yeah, but that's not going to help this fuel cell.
That's right. We
We're
got to
like-
get it all the way down.
If we can't save that
Go ahead,
pressure,
you
we're
can
going to
save-
lose this
it looked like
third
the
fuel
vehicle
cell.
stabilized considerably
Raj.
over the last few minutes.
Larry,
Go.
you better give me a rate on
Either whatever was
pressure.
venting is stopped venting, it's empty.
Tell me when I'm going to lose
Or
it.
do you feel it
Okay.
could also be associated with the...
So this is where the grim realization really kicks in. They know that they're losing pressure, so they can actually make a fairly simple extrapolation till when the pressure gets down to the point when they can't run the fuel cell anymore. And that's essentially it. There would be no more stable power supply or oxygen in the command module.
Zero. Okay.
Flight Econ.
Go ahead, Econ.
The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM systems. I'm going to have to power way down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to save the O2 for the third fuel cell, for fuel cell 2 rather.
Roger that.
The heaters aren't working. Now let's start thinking circuit breakers. You got any circuit breakers you want to check there?
We've seen the current, didn't we?
We saw the current, Flight.
You saw the current.
Here. We can't tell whether it's
Okay, look, let's check it anyway, Flight. You're right.
It looks like it's cycling up a PCM count from 297 to 302. Give me some circuit breakers to check.
Okay, panel 226.
So at this point, they've kind of accepted that the command module is dying. The thing is that with such a grim diagnosis, you'd better be certain.
Econ,
I want
when do
you
you
to
want
get
that
some guys
delog
figuring
started?
out minimum power
you can
in
try
the LEM
55,
sustained life.
A point that is brought home by less than 1 minute later, the flight controller is asking, I want you to get some guys figuring out the minimum power in the lunar module to sustain life.
Jack, looking outside, the number of particles has diminished greatly, almost ceased now, which indicates maybe what it was venting has almost stopped.
Roger, Jack. Thank you. We copy.
Almost an hour after the incident, they finally have an estimate of how much fuel cell power they have left on the spacecraft.
Flight, we're going to hit 100 psi in an hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there.
So for about the first half hour after the incident, they were playing things prudently. Now they've got a deadline of how much power they've got left on the command module. And now they're considering more bold courses of action.
EPS, go. Listen, Span's input was to close those reactant valves on the fuel cells that we open circuited. We could be losing it through the reactant valves. You want to shut the O2 down?
So the react valves are the reactant valves. That's how the hydrogen and oxygen get into the fuel cells. Once you close those off, you can basically isolate the fuel cell and shut it down. But it's an irreversible process. So this is why they really weren't considering doing this sort of thing earlier on.
If we close the reactant valves, we lost the fuel cells. I'm not sure if this problem's not back up in the tank somewhere. And if we can get that O2 straightened out, it might straighten out.
I don't think we're going to get it straightened out there.
I don't either.
So it is that after about an hour, when they've exhausted all other possible options, they're now coming down to the desperation step, which is closing the reactant valves in the hope that that isolates the leak.
Okay. I'll go to the SSR page. You want me to go through that whole smash for fuel cell shutdown, is that correct?
You want them to go through that whole smash for fuel cell shutdown?
How about that,
Yeah, heaters and all?
Yeah, you want to go through the fuel cell shutdown.
That's right.
That's firm flight. He's gone through much of it already by the time.
Yep, they can shut down fuel cells 1 and 3. Now, those fuel cells haven't actually provided any real power for the last hour or so they're not really losing anything at this point.
Okay, 13, we want you to turn the inline heaters off on fuel cell 1. Then we want you to go through the fuel cell shutdown procedure on fuel cell 3. Read back.
Okay, shut down the inline heaters on fuel cell 1. We're proceeding with the shutdown special subroutine for fuel cell 3.
That's affirmative.
An hour and 10 minutes in, and they're thinking about what happens when the command module gets back to Earth. They need to save those batteries, otherwise the command module won't be able to safely re-enter the atmosphere.
We could put the fuel cell on
13, we
main
need
B, but the only trouble is we're in the danger of losing all 3 fuel cells, and we don't want to use those batteries except for entry. So when we lose the cells, we want to shut the bird down.
Somewhat over an hour and 10 minutes in, and a new flight controller takes over.
Soon. Fuel cell 2 is working okay. That's affirmative. Unless we do something to get that oxygen, it's not going to do us any good to save fuel cells. That's affirmative. Okay, huh? Okay. Ecom, I don't like the way that O2 pressure is going down. If you want to do something about these other reactant valves, let's make up our mind.
So at this point, they've closed down the reactant valves to one of their dead fuel cells, and now they're discussing whether they should do it to the other one as well.
Seems to me we have no choice but to go ahead and do it. The pressure continues to drop. We're not going to have anything left soon anyway. So it looks like the next best thing to try is to go ahead and turn the reactants off on fuel cell 1.
An hour and 20 minutes in, and the new flight controller wants to be sure that he's doing the right thing.
Ecom flight.
Go flight.
Is there any chance that I'm just looking at a bad pressure reading here? I'm going to shut off the second fuel cell now. Is there any data you can correlate to say that, yeah, that pressure's going down?
On the O2 tank?
Yes. You understand my question?
I understand your question. The temperatures are also dropping. Let me get a verification on that. Stand by for just a minute.
All right.
ECS, Econ.
Go ahead.
What kind of verification we got on that drop in pressure besides the temperature dropping?
And about 5 minutes of deliberation later...
Well, the rate is slower, but we have a little less pressure, too, so we would expect it to be a little bit slower.
You are sure, then? You want to close it?
Seems to me we have no choice, Frank.
Okay, Jack, we're getting that last confirmation. Stand by, please.
We're going that flight. Okay, that's your best judgment. We think we ought to close that off, huh? That's affirmative. It's dropping down to 234. Yeah. Okay, fuel cell number 1 reactant's going off.
Okay, 13, we verify that we want you to close down, shut down fuel cell 1, close the reacts valve.
Stand by.
Fuel cell shutdown procedure is complete for fuel cell 1.
Jeez, it's really going down.
Roger.
At this point, they've more or less accepted that the command service module is dying, and therefore the best that they can do is use what little power generating capacity they have left to put as much charge in the batteries as they can for later.
Lady, come. Go. Like charge battery 8. Yeah, I was wondering about that. Let me get the high gain power off first, okay? So it's no big deal on the amps.
That's right. And we'd like to use whatever time we have to put energy back in the battery.
Yeah, and I see O2 tank 1 pressure is 217.
That's affirmative. Still coming down.
About an hour and a half in, and the new flight controller asks a rather, bizarre question.
That's right, fine. Tank 2.
Okay, now, is it possible that we still have that tank and it's good? And we could somehow get power on B and use it?
Not likely, flight.
What's not likely, Clint?
Not likely to be able to actually have anything left in the tank.
You don't think so?
I don't think so, but we'll pulse that one too.
All right.
Let me get you a time it looks like we've got on tank 1 here.
All right.
ECSE time. Did you say 40 minutes?
No more than 40.
Okay, you guys feel like there's any possibility of having anything in tank 2?
No, I don't think we got anything left in tank 2. There may be a little bit of liquid, but essentially nothing in tank 2.
And a few minutes after that, they're now looking at the lunar module as a lifeboat. A thought that is immediately echoed by the crew of Apollo 13.
Ladycom, looks like we've got about 40 minutes left in that tank.
Okay, does it look like it's still going down?
That's affirmative, yes.
It's slowly going to 0, and
Like
we're starting to think about lifeboat.
What does he read on board?
Now,
Yeah, that's what we're thinking about too.
And still, at about the hour and a half mark.
I'm trying to be sure that you're satisfied that there's nothing else we can do.
About all we can do is power down and let heat leak help us some, which is probably going to be trivial.
Okay. There's nothing else you want to try. That's the only reason I'm delaying on this battery A charge, Clint, to be sure you've gone through everything and you don't have any other tricks up your sleeve.
Sure don't, flight.
And the new flight controller still seems to be optimistic in his appraisal of the situation.
Ecom, go one more time around that room. We're letting this thing go down, although I realize we don't have any more thoughts to do, but I want to be sure that if there's anything we can do here that we're doing it.
Yeah, we can power down.
To keep your...
Just power down, flight. All we can power down will put us in that much better configuration.
Okay, I got that part, but are there any other things that you can do besides that? That's what I'm getting at.
Negative, flight.
Okay, we'll work on it, flight.
Flight, we're not going to have anything in about 40 minutes here.
Ecom ECS.
Go ahead, ECS.
This is leak rates increasing all the time. Looks like we've got about 18 minutes left.
Go ahead. Okay, got an update on the time. Looks like we've got about 18 minutes until we get down to 100 PSI, and that's sort of the cutoff point.
All right, but we're charging battery A.
Well, that doesn't mean much in 18 minutes, though, but we're doing all we can do.
Yeah, even with a well thought out and well made piece of kit, space can kill you really quickly, especially once you get away from that nice little thin skin of life support that coats the surface of the planet. Now, the crew of Apollo 13 did actually make it back alive after some more fairly harrowing adventures. But I hope this little walk through some of the details of the spacecraft has given you a real feel to just how close you continually are to dying in space, where you are completely reliant on machines working to keep you alive. But some might be thinking, hang on, how did that oxygen tank blow up in the first place? There's no possible way it could happen. It was tested to over 1,500 PSI and never greatly exceeded 1,000 PSI on the spacecraft. So how could it explode and cripple the spacecraft? Well, I was hoping you were going to ask that, because that's going to be the core of the next video on Apollo 13, where, yeah, I might actually have to deal with some liquid oxygen. So if you enjoyed that, give it a thumbs up. And let me know if you enjoyed it and want to see more like this. And definitely subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more like this. And as ever, if you really like the work of this channel and want to support it directly, you can do it through Patreon. And thanks for watching.